Now, it's never been a secret who George Lucas made the first Star Wars film for, with him saying on numerous occasions that he was trying to make something for 12-year-old boys, that they were the intended target, but that it ended up working for virtually everyone, for people from age 8 to 88, and for boys and girls alike. And this accidental success with a wide audience, let's call it, was no doubt in large part thanks to the vast array of good, relatable characters in the film, including Princess Leia, who many regard as the first ever strong female character put on screen, which is not exactly true or even close to it, but she was no doubt one of the best there's ever been, and without question her popularity, and the fact that clearly girls and women could also love something like Star Wars too, that had a huge impact on entertainment, especially geared towards kids, in the years to come. In fact, virtually every cartoon I then watched growing up in the 80s, in the post-Star Wars and Princess Leia world, they had at least one, if not more than one, what you might call strong female character in it to potentially lure in a female viewer or two, or many more in some cases. He-Man, for example, a cartoon and toy line that, obviously from its name alone, was heavily geared towards boys, had multiple strong and capable women that either fought alongside He-Man or acted as one of his main adversaries. And those female characters were probably a big reason why somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% of kids who played with He-Man back then, or who watched the cartoon and begged their parents for He-Man toys, were actually young girls. And this interesting revelation, no surprise, made Mattel, creators of He-Man, sit up and take notice back in the day, especially when the overall sales of He-Man surpassed sales of Barbie. And thus, to cater to and grow this market, the female He-Man audience, She-Ra, sister of He-Man, was born and not only started to show up on toy shelves, but she also got her own cartoon, one that actually replaced or took the spot of what was supposed to be a third season of the original He-Man cartoon. So, instead of a new season of He-Man, kids in 1985 got the first two seasons of He-Man all over again. They were repeated alongside the new She-Ra cartoon, followed by a second season of She-Ra in 1986, and still no new He-Man episodes, just more reruns. Which is about when something very interesting happened. He-Man toy sales utterly collapsed in 1987, and I mean collapsed. In 1986, sales had been $400 million, which is just a ridiculous number. And then in 1987, there was only $7 million in sale. And yes, you heard that right. We're talking a roughly 98% drop in sales. Now, there are many theories as to why this happened. Everything from He-Man's time had simply come, that kids had moved on from him. He'd been around since 1982, and the toy line was, shall we say, getting stale and extending too far, or just making too many figures in general, without enough of the original figures to be found in stores anymore, especially when these new characters or figures being made weren't appearing in the show anymore, as had been the case before. Basically, He-Man was a giant commercial for the toys. And that was happening because, again, new episodes weren't being made to showcase the new toys and new characters. Then there was also the belief or theory that when the franchise started to focus more on She-Ra, boys started to lose interest and check out. That, in a sense, she had emasculated He-Man by also having the power, which was a catchphrase specifically designed to get the attention of boys, though, yes, She-Ra did have a slightly different one. Either way, with She-Ra around, they moved on because of her. Which, to use a very popular modern term, sounds rather problematic. That if true, if the reason for the fall of He-Man, or even a large part of it, was boys refusing to share a franchise with girls that, again, simply by the name alone was clearly geared towards them from the start. I mean, I'd argue a name doesn't get any more masculine than He-Man. Anyway, if true, this would no doubt be called problematic today, that boys were rejecting a strong female character, taking the spotlight away from a male character, in what had, again, clearly started as a male-centric or male-focused series or a show designed for primarily boys. Even though, as mentioned before, there had, from the very start, been strong female characters in He-Man that boys had been A-okay with all along. And that, just like with Leia in Star Wars, they were likely a significant reason why girls took interest in both He-Man and Star Wars, and became fans of these franchises. Not the only reasons, mind you. I think more girls or women enjoy things like sci-fi and fantasy than some might realize, especially as the years have gone by and there's less of a stigma around them liking these sort of things. I've talked many times before about how my wife, and she's talked about this over on our channel together, about how she grew up loving these sorts of things, but faced a lot of, shall we say, pushback or criticism from other girls for liking it, and not so much from boys. And on the flip side, boys, or even grown men, can get into things mainly focused towards girls. I think most of us have heard of bronies before, or adult men who got into My Little Pony and started watching the show and collecting the toys. Though from what I've heard, and I don't know how true this is or not, but it kind of started as a joke on 4chan, as many things do, that became real and has been dying down in recent years. There are no longer BronyCons or anything quite like that anymore, like we saw roughly a decade ago at this point. But anyway, I'd argue if characters like Teela and Evelyn didn't exist, if He-Man truly was just he-men fighting each other and doing other manly things, fewer, though not zero, girls would have taken interest in it, and that would have been just fine. Similar to how it's just fine how very few boys like or take interest in things like Barbie and My Little Pony, other than those aforementioned bronies, and that no one would ever complain they should cater more towards boys or grown men so they can get more into them or more easily into them. Basically, it was once believed that what appealed to boys and girls was, in general, different. That, to be very blunt, and some people might not like this overly simplified description, but when it came to toys, boys tended to like to bash them together to simulate combat, and girls tended to like to dress them up. This difference in appeal was even known by Disney when they purchased Marvel back in 2009, with many articles from that time, including this one from Reuters, pointing out in the very first paragraph that this was being done to broaden Disney's lineup of movie franchises that appealed to boys. This was then also one of the main reasons why Bob Iger, as talked about in his own book, pursued the purchase of Lucasfilm so diligently. He wanted Disney to expand and not just be known for the properties it had created, properties that mainly appealed to girls, which he saw a lot of pushback for. Not everyone at Disney at the time thought things like Marvel or Star Wars fit the Disney image exactly. And if we're being honest, yeah, Disney did have more appeal in general to girls than boys. And I stress in general, because I'm sure long before the purchase of Marvel and Lucasfilm, plenty of men loved Disney, and I think that's great and just fine. There's no issues with that. But at the same time, there are probably a lot of men out there who never paid any attention to Disney until they purchased Marvel and Lucasfilm, because the first thing that came to their mind when they heard Disney is animated movies and shows for kids, as well as Disney princesses, and that just didn't interest them at all. And, to his credit, Bob Iger realized the potential in changing that image. He realized the potential of having more franchises that, again, appealed primarily to boys and men, as that Reuters article and many others back at the time pointed out. And then Marvel, for roughly its first 10 years with the MCU, focused pretty much primarily on male characters and saw incredible success. They primarily saw the numbers go up for each new movie and culminated with Avengers Endgame grossing $2.8 billion at the worldwide box office. Lucasfilm with Star Wars, however, took a different approach and had different results. They decided to focus on a female character with their first Star Wars trilogy, with the sequel trilogy, and saw interest and box office numbers decline as the trilogy went on. But it wasn't that decision alone to make the main character female that doomed them. I mean, if Rey had been rejected outright from the very start by a sizable percentage of male fans, there's almost no chance The Force Awakens, the first film in the trilogy, grosses $2 billion worldwide. Basically, male fans were more than happy to give Rey a chance. Not to mention, we are talking Star Wars here. We're talking the franchise that many credit for creating the first strong female character with Leia, and then giving us another in the prequels with Padme, not to mention plenty of others in the animated shows, books, and comics along the way or over the years. Male Star Wars fans, despite what some try to claim today, are very much used to and embrace good female characters. They've literally been doing it since the first film in the franchise, and they've never really rejected any until Rey came along. So what went wrong with her then? What went wrong with Rey that she has been or was rejected by so many fans? Well, it was no secret, I mean it was literally told to us by Kathleen Kennedy and others, that Rey was meant to be a character for women and girls, not unlike how She-Ra was meant to be for girls as well, once upon a time, and got a show that took over for He-Man, and, well, we saw how that all played out in the end. But anyway, the idea or thought behind Rey was that since none of the previous female characters in the films had been main characters, that this had been a sort of barrier to entry for girls or women, that they maybe couldn't get into, say, Luke Skywalker the same way they would have been able to had he been a female character. So now Rey was going to fix that problem. It was now their turn to get a hero and a movie so they could love Star Wars the same way boys and men always had. But there's a pretty big logical flaw with this line of thinking, because if you say or concede the fact that women can't get into or relate with Luke, which I'm not saying I agree with, but if that is your line of thinking, and thus women can't love Star Wars the same way because of it, it would make sense, again logically, that men would therefore have trouble getting into or relating with Rey and loving Star Wars the same way anymore, if that love was predicated on a male lead, which again, that is the claim they are making, that it is a very, very important thing, who the lead is, and something that needs to be changed for women to enjoy it the same way. I mean, you can't say the problem with Star Wars for women is that it doesn't have a female lead, and then get angry at men if they claim they can't get into it the same way without a male lead. That would be a pretty blatant double standard. And yet, that's exactly what we now oftentimes see. Men who are in any way, shape, or form, or for any reason unhappy with Rey, are chastised and called toxic, or like they're trying to gatekeep, or don't think there should be any women in Star Wars or who watch Star Wars. Yet it's considered understandable for women to have not liked or been able to relate to Luke, which, as I was kind of saying before, I don't agree with. I think that's ridiculous. Plenty of women love Luke Skywalker, the same way plenty of men like or relate to characters like Leia, Padme, Ahsoka, Mara Jade, and so on. And so if males can relate to female characters, and if females can relate to male characters, if that's not exactly the real issue here, then what exactly is? What's the problem with Rey that she is so disliked by so many male fans, when other female characters before her haven't been? They've been, again, warmly accepted. Well, it's the problem with not only her, but also other modern-day strong female characters inserted into, if we're being fair and honest about what they originally were, but being inserted into what have tended to be male-focused franchises, and the implication that something was wrong with them that is now being fixed thanks to the inclusion of these new female characters that oftentimes do show up the male characters or are just better than what they once were. We're essentially being told now it was wrong to have a franchise that catered primarily to boys and men, even though roughly 10 years ago that seemed to be a very successful and openly talked about strategy for the MCU by Disney, and no one, until more recently, questioned that approach, an approach that led to, again, a $2.8 billion film, that being Endgame. But now, if there isn't at least a 50-50 split between male and female fans, or perfect representation in the films, there's a problem and we simply can't have that. Which, no, isn't me saying we should never have a female lead in Star Wars or Marvel ever again, or that these franchises can't be, in some ways, more inviting to female fans, of which there are many, and were many long before Rey came along to fix them for female fans. Me defending men or boys and their different interests does not automatically equate to an attack on women. That is a preposterous jump to make. I mean, I love female fans. Literally, my wife is into virtually all the same things I am, and I am the most grateful man on earth to have met her and to share my life and my hobbies with her. But she too hates when these franchises overtly try to cater to her and women in general. Seeing women outshine men just to make a point about women being better than men is not why she started watching them. And no surprise, it's certainly not going to appeal to most men either. The reason boys stop watching He-Man seems to be the same reason many are now checking out of Star Wars. That being a company realized there were, in theory, more profits to be made by trying to expand its fan base or to cater more towards the minority part of the fan base, not realizing what fans in the majority, both male and female, had signed up for and liked about it in the first place. Well, that's all I got for this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think about any and all of this. Why do you think Rey was rejected where other female characters in Star Wars have been warmly embraced? And am I onto something with all this, or am I dead wrong? Whatever you think, leave those comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.